The reading that's set for today comes from John's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 1 to 14. It's part of the Last Supper discourse that John records with Jesus and the disciples. Jesus has washed his disciples' feet. He predicts Judas's betrayal and sees Judas leave. There is that amazingly charged moment when all the disciples are wondering who could it be who's going to betray Jesus. And after Judas's departure, Jesus gives the disciples a new commandment. You must love one another as I have loved you. If you have love for one another, then everyone will know that you are my disciples. Then Peter says, where you're going, I will follow. And Jesus says, you will betray me, deny me 3 times. Into this amazingly charged atmosphere, then, we have this reading. Do not be worried and upset, Jesus told them. Believe in God and believe also in me. There are many rooms in my Father's house, and I am going to prepare a place for you. I would not tell you this if it were not so. And after I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to myself, so that you will be where I am. You know the way that leads to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way to get there? Jesus answered him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except by me. Now that you have known me, he said to them, you will know my Father also. And from now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, that is all we need. Jesus answered, for a long time I have been with you all, yet you do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Why then do you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe, Philip, that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I have spoken to you, Jesus said to his disciples, do not come from me. The Father who remains in me does his own work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. If not, believe because of the things I do. I'm telling you the truth. Whoever believes in me will do what I do. Yes, they will do even greater things. Because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask for in my name, so that the Father's glory will be shown through the Son. If you ask me for anything in my name, I will do it. Now, this is an incredible reading, open to so much interpretation, and so much that is difficult and sometimes used in a way that confuses rather than illustrates. I think our best model is to go back to the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. You'll remember how Jesus said to Nicodemus, nobody can enter the kingdom of heaven unless he is born again. And Nicodemus, like most of us, had difficulty with that and wanted to explore through his own intellect and logic so that he would understand what Jesus meant. And it just didn't make any sense. How could one possibly be physically born again? And Jesus talks of being born spiritually, and it's a metaphor just as amazing and comprehensive and complete and fundamental as the act of creative birth, to be spiritually reborn. It's a new creation, something that many of our worship songs pick up. And here in this discourse too, Jesus is talking to the disciples that they have seen the way to get there. You know the way that leads to the place where I'm going. But even in that very simple, apparently obvious English language sentence that I've just read, you know the way that leads to the place where I am going, there is so much jargon. You know the way. Now, what do we mean by that? The way. So if we take our Nicodemus stance, we say, well, the way is the direction. It's what we see when we fire up Google Maps and type in a postcode. It's the path that maps out the place and the way we get from A to B. That's the way. Okay, so that's the place we're going. And you know the way, he says, that leads to the place where I am going. Now, place, okay, destination, a physical place maybe, where I am going. Okay, so it sounds like Jesus is making a physical journey, starting at A, ending at B, and we all know the directions. And this is what the disciples latch on to. But just as Jesus said to Nicodemus, you need to be born again, so when Jesus says, you know the way that leads to the place where I am going, he's not talking about a place. He's not talking about a way. He's talking about being in a state, a transformative, born again state. You are in this state, and you can be in a different state. And the characteristics of that different state, as he's already laid out, is one of total and utter worship of God and love and service of both God and your neighbor. It is an attitude of complete and total, utter love. If you have love for one another, then everyone will know that you are my disciples. And that is, and always has been, the characteristic of the Christian life. That people should see in a person something of God's incarnate love because of the things they do. Their religious practices, their spiritual discipline, their quest in Wesleyan quest for spiritual perfection is their own unique way of working out the love they have from God. But the transformation that we've seen over the last few weeks in John's Gospel and all the way through the New Testament is when somebody comes to see, and not just physically see, that Jesus was God. And that when they come into a contact and a relationship with Jesus, they are in contact with the God who made all things. And the only possible response to that situation is, as Thomas said in the upper room appearance, my Lord and my God. Mary at the empty tomb just a few weeks ago, I have seen the Lord. And every single person ever since who has had an encounter with the living God, who then can say to the world, I have met with the Lord. And people can say, well, what did that feel like? How did it happen? How might it be for me? And these are irrelevant questions. They are to stay in our physical, normal world and seek an explanation and a rationale for how we can capture and bottle and place instructions on something that would say, here's how you get to know God in your life. And it's not like that. It can't be like that. If we start from the perspective of human intelligence and a belief that we can rationalize and logic out and explain a relationship with the God who made all things, then we're already on the wrong track. And so the discourse goes on with the disciples, when one after one they say these things. Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we follow you? Philip says, show us the Father, that's all we need. On and on and on, the questing and the idea that somehow this relationship can be explained. Jesus is saying to them, as John has said from the opening words of his first chapter, Jesus was God. There is no division. Jesus was not God on a temporary visit to the world while God remained wherever God was. Jesus was God. And that's why that phrase, which is so often mistreated, nobody comes to the Father except through me, is often so very wrongly used. Nobody comes to God unless they've met with God. This is not a unique claim for the Christian faith per se. Everything is bigger than everything we've ever created. Everything is larger in God's world. God is God. And if you encounter God by looking at Jesus and seeing God, then that, I would say, is the most complete, most obvious revelation that God has ever given. Because to become human, to become like us, to walk among us, to talk with us, to show us life in all its fullness, yes, that's the easiest way in. But it's not the only way. You can encounter God in so many different ways. And so when we read that phrase, nobody comes to the Father except by me, yet nobody comes to God except through God. But how you experience God can be different, and it frankly doesn't matter. What's important is that you do encounter God in your lives, and that through that encounter, you are blown away by the revelation of love that is infinite and universal. Love that is for all people everywhere, for all time. And that our own labels, our own traditions, our own institutions, our own context are completely irrelevant. The relationship that a human being can have with his or her creator is as pure and as simple as it has always been, and needs no intermediaries, and needs no definition, and certainly needs no human logic. We do not come to God through a satisfaction of our own intellect, that we've sat down and worked out a reasoned argument, that we've proposed a thesis, we've tested it in real world situations, and we've come to a reasonable assumption that it's right. That is not how it works. It cannot be how it works. How can we, in our small minds, the minds that God created, come to some complete understanding of God? And anyway, none of this matters. The quest for satisfaction, the quest for proof through demonstration and experiment are not the way that Jesus said we must follow. You know the way to the place where I am going. And if that way is not a map, it is surrender and submission. It is childlike openness and invitation to the God who made us and the God who so desperately wants us to know God in our hearts and minds. For we are then the creation that God set out to build. We have all the gifts and talents that God has given us. We have a world of people who we can relate to and who we can serve. But we need God in our lives to set us free from all that human questing. And so the constant return and the constant questing for logic and explanation are just not relevant. It's so attractive. It's so us. But it's not the way of spiritual things. We don't encounter God by uncovering God under a rock, by questing for a secret place and ending up in a marvelous destination and saying, ta-da, there is God. God will find us when we let God into our lives. And those two are simple words. Words are just so difficult because what they mean in one person's head, they don't mean when somebody else hears them. We all have our own lenses. We all have our own perspectives. Truth is such a difficult concept to get across. But the reality for me is that God finds you, and then there is no other response than adoration and love and joy and peace and a desire to share that with whoever and whenever you can. In our current lockdown situations, many people are feeling frustrated with the continual inability to go the places they want to go and resume what they might think of as a normal life. But this lockdown situation has something relevant to our reading to teach us, and that is to be still, to stop being so busy, to stop being so focused on the next thing and going from one place to another, physically and metaphorically. To stand still, to simply be, to understand one's state, that we are held in God's loving arms, and that the response is to abandon ourselves to that moment and be blessed by it. Not to constantly be asking the questions, what now? What next? When? What? How? But to be, and to recognize in the beauty of God's creation and in the wonder of the God's people who are around us, with all the variety and glory that that brings, to be open to new things and to see everything around us and take delight in it. Be at peace. Be filled with joy. Have a firm assurance and a knowledge that we are loved now and always, and have great confidence in God, not through any questing, but simply by abandonment, submission, and joy. The disciples were in a highly charged situation, full of emotion, the most difficult state to try and remain clear-minded and level-headed and childlike. In those situations of conflict and strife, we want to take control. We want to be in charge. We want to know the way and the time when things will end. God says, "Come to me, all of you who are tired from carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." The disciples were with God, and in a post-resurrection age, so are we. We need to just recognize that fact, and maybe the peace of our current lockdown situation will give us that opportunity.